Pivot. I'm Santi, and I have my awesome co-host here, Meagan. Today, we are going to be chatting with Brandon. Brandon is a staff product manager at Buffer, and I'm going to flip it over to him.
Hi, I'm Brandon. I am staff PM at Buffer, which is a consumer SaaS product all about helping you promote and manage your online presence on social media. I have been in the field of product for something like 12 years at this point. I started in kind of the Boston area startup scene. I worked for Wayfair for a while, which is a big e-commerce player in the US, bounced back and forth between startups, and now I am here. Yeah, that's my deal.
Thank you, Brandon, for that intro. We appreciate it. It helps set the scene for what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to go ahead and just dive right into the questions that we have. Can you share a pivotal moment that made you say, yep, product management is the path for me that I want to go down?
I have kind of a funny answer to that question, which is honestly, I don't think I have one. So for a bit of background, I went to school for music. That's kind of been like my hobby, expensive vocation off to the side. And I graduated from music school just after the financial crisis and during a period when music piracy and like trying to figure out the future of the streaming side of the music industry was like, it was a very like tricky time to find a career in the music industry. So I ended up landing at this like music booking startup in Boston and, started by answering phones and kind of gradually made my way into products. And it kind of was just like almost a path of survival, trying to figure out a career and something sustainable where I could make money, do stuff that was interesting, and, always have a path forward. Starting in customer service was awesome. I still love talking to customers like all the time, but I wanted to not have that be sort of a dead end. And, it just kind of kept snowballing from there. After I left that company to go to a different company, it was very different. There were some things that I learned to love, some things that I really didn't like. Then I went to a different company and I liked and didn't like a bunch of other things. I even questioned whether I wanted the same product. So like, I don't know. It's kind of just what I've been doing.
I love that because I also started out in that similar background of just like being at a startup and just making it work. I feel like once you kind of get into a startup, you like try different things and you try to like move up, right? And you have different experiences. And then you like dip your toe in somewhere and you're like, I really like playing around here in this department. And like it's so easy to find something that you love and also just like feel accomplished at a startup, which is just so special.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a big piece of it for me. Like there are probably some specific activities I can think of that were like that really resonated with me. Like the first time I opened like Balsamic, that wireframing software, and I was like, oh, I can literally start just sketching out a possible solution to this problem that our artist community at the time was like complaining about. I'm not a designer. I'm not in a, like, I can't code the solution, but I can at least envision a solution here. I also really love like kind of the psychological aspects of like user research and talking to customers, but like I don't have a psychology degree. I don't think I'd necessarily want to or be a good psychologist. So this is like a weird way of like blending a lot of almost like seemingly random but all very important and related activities into a job. And that's what I like about it. It's not like any one particular pivotal moment, I guess.
I like that. And I really resonate with that design piece too, because I started in startup as well. And, the time that I was doing my heaviest product work, we didn't have a designer. So it really was a cool thing to be able to create things like out of your head and be like, hey, here's a potential path you can go down and like, let's tweak this. Let's work on this. It really did afford me the opportunity to just look into all those different like avenues of product and see what resonated with me. And I loved a lot of them. Some things I really liked, I didn't realize I would like. So I find it to be a really good kind of way to see where you might find kind of your zone.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like the best product people that I know really are jacks of all trades and that they can sort of like adapt and fit in and add a lot of value kind of no matter the context. So if you skew heavily into like the design and user research side, or you're very technical, you can kind of be very successful in those specific places. But then if you're a very technical PM and then you go move to a startup that maybe either doesn't value that technical expertise or just doesn't have a need for it as much, you kind of flounder a little bit or you don't feel like you belong. And therefore that adaptability becomes super important. And me where I'm coming in with a creative background. I'm not an engineer. Like I sort of can code a little bit. I can sort of design a little bit and I can kind of like flex to whatever the needs arise. I think that's actually really worked for me and something that I really enjoy. I can kind of like have my hand in a lot of different stuff.
You just mentioned that you are a creative person, and it kind of went back to like our pre-conversation before this episode when we were talking about music and how it's one of your current hobbies, and you actually just brought that up kind of like as your initial path as well. So I'm curious, like, how do you flex that creative muscle in your product management role?
Yeah, it's a good question. I try to a lot because honestly, if I don't, I feel like that's when the job becomes soul crushing and I want to quit it all. The least successful roles I have had in my career, I think, are the ones where I wasn't able to flex or I didn't really feel much creative energy. For a while, I spent a lot of time working on, sort of like API products internally to, the company I was working for, the division of company I was working for. In those roles, it's really like a performance optimization game, a costs optimization game, or some flavor combination of the two. And those are really interesting for a while until they start to like, become just a lot of the same thing over and over. And the challenges are really exciting for maybe an engineer working on that problem. But the product's role is actually like kind of, I don't want to call it simple. It doesn't allow for that, at least in my experience, flexing of creative muscles that much. In the role that I'm in now, I do get to be highly creative because I'm thinking about how do we as like Buffer start to make our product more appealing to these different, wide swaths of potential customers and not in a way that your traditional B2B SaaS product would, where we're intentionally focused on the down market and not hiring a sales team. So that leads to a lot of really interesting opportunities to almost like play the role of sales and advocacy, but in the products. And that's something that like I don't see a lot of other companies doing that in our domain. So it's a really interesting opportunity as a product manager to kind of flex into that a little bit. So I try to like look for the opportunity to be creative. And if I either don't see them or it's like in a space I don't really just find very energizing, that's when the job becomes less fun for me.
I think you said you had 12 years of product management experience, right?
Yeah, so I started in tech around 2010 when I graduated school. My first conventional product job was in like 2012 for that first booking startup I worked at. So I've been doing product in some form or another since then.
I imagine you flex that creative muscle in a lot of different roles and you've looked for that creative role.
My sort of like path and the companies I've worked for, it's like weird and very unconventional, I think, in comparison to like what you see a lot of on like LinkedIn, where you see, someone has tenure at Facebook and then Google and then Amazon. Like the I mentioned Wayfair earlier before. That was the largest company I've worked for. Other than that, I think the largest company I worked for was maybe 700 people when I had left that company. A lot of startups, a lot of, different spaces. I wasn't like always in marketplaces, although I spent a good amount of my career in marketplaces. A couple different SaaS products in very different industries. One of my favorite previous jobs was for this design collaboration SaaS called Abstract, which is all about trying to solve the problem of design collaboration across complex networks of files in a design system, which is something that every PM and designer, probably is familiar with, and engineers to an extent as well. And we tried to solve that problem when the design tool of choice was Sketch. Very cool problem that was unlike anything I've worked before. And it was very directly relevant to like my day to day. So we dog fed the product a lot. But then as Figma came along and sort of overtook Sketch as like the design tool of choice, we lost our product market fit and had to go scramble to like ship a new product. So then I was able to, do 0 to 1 product in a space that needed that. We had to come up with a new offering that was differentiated for this new Figma led ecosystem. And that was a great opportunity to exercise that creativity in a way that I wasn't doing previously at the company. So that was very different than like other startups I've worked at. Worlds different from like the prior work I'd done at Wayfair. So yeah, I guess in short, I have really enjoyed, trying my hand at a lot of different things, a lot of different spaces, and a lot of different types of teams.
And I think it speaks to just that perpetually curious nature that so many PMs have in general, right? We have questions. We want to learn things. We want to know things. We're curious. We will dig in. And I think that you are just like really embodying that literally in how you've gone and done all of these different things and tried to play with different elements of the product cycle, different roles and responsibilities and things like that. And you really did get to create a lot of momentum that way. That's the essence of product in a way, being curious and creating and getting everyone together to row in the same direction.
I told you earlier, it really came out of a need for survival. But yeah, there's aspects of it that I like, and I am generally a curious and I guess creatively minded person, so it works.
I was really curious if you have any like surprises, either good ones or like more challenging surprises that you would like to share from when you first started out in product.
Yeah. I think the big two in terms of like surprises, which I don't really know if I'd call them good or bad, they're just like realities, is one, like your hunger and your curiosity, to kind of call back to what you just said, Santi, like those are the two things that drive, it seems like, the success. You could have really strong, acumen technically or business or whatever, but like you need to chase something to its logical end and then bring it back. You need to make sense of what some random non-technically savvy user is complaining about and translate that to an engineer and also to an executive and also to designers. And like being curious and then being able to translate all of that curiosity and all those inputs into something useful and productive, like that basically is the job, regardless of your upbringing or your experience, regardless of what parts of that you really are stronger or sort of weak at. That was sort of like the surprise, I guess. The other big one, and I didn't know this until I had changed jobs a couple of times, that also is a completely different job at every company you work. And potentially sometimes in different departments within a company that you work, going from one startup to another, then going from a 40-person startup to a 9,000 person at the time company that was Wayfair, switching departments at Wayfair, then leaving and going back to a startup. And then, and you can learn more about this on my LinkedIn, I guess. After, 2 years at a startup, I went back to Wayfair. Wayfair in 2021 was very different than Wayfair in 2016. And therefore, like each of those jobs were so different. There are obviously like, fundamentals and past experience you can apply. And I actually think that really helped me, kind of that diversity of experiences. But the core of what you do is like parts of it are the same, but actually like the day-to-day of what that looks like is so different from job to job. My current job at Buffer is probably more akin to the work I was doing in like some of my early startup days. It's comparable to some of the stuff I was doing in certain spaces that I worked on at Wayfair. For example, I mentioned sort of having to build more of a consumer version of this SaaS product that we currently offer. It takes me back to the user research for the 0 to 1 product I shipped for Wayfair on the consumer side. You had to research how customers shop for their homes. We really tried to target millennial and Gen X women as sort of like the primary, you know, target customer of Wayfair. How they experience AR tools to sort of like visualize how furniture looks in their home is very different than like a tech person. So you have to sort of, think about, get into their mindset. And I'm having to do a lot of that now as a product manager for a social media company, trying to build tools for like non-tech savvy business owners who are sort of like needing to do their own social media to promote their business. So there's a lot of transferable skill there that is also relevant to like some of my previous startup work. But the way we work is nothing like the way we worked at Wayfair in terms of like organizational design, the type of documentation and sort of like approvals you need to get. We're much more akin to a nimble startup in that sense. Anybody who sort of spends a lot of time working as a PM in one company and then decides they want to move on and look for another job assumes that they can just take what they do at one job and apply it easily to the next. There are going to be ways in which some of the norms of working at, let's say, Meta just do not work at a startup, or even vice versa, going from a small company to a big company. So it's all really about keeping an open mind, being adaptable, and really reflecting on extracting what you did well at one company and really thinking about how that does or does not work in the new company.
I love that you mentioned that. I have a really great mentor of mine. We worked together at the startup I was at. He was co-founder and CPO. And so we were chatting one day and we were talking about product. And he said to me, Santi, you can ask 5 people, 5 different people what product management is. And you're going to get 5 different answers. And I remember it stuck with me ever since because it's so true. And it's, to your earlier point, every day is different. Like there is no 2 days that are the same in a product role. And like you said, it's like iterating on a product, right? Everything can kind of be linked back to being like a product, your experiences. You take what worked from that experience and see how it could benefit the current situation you're in, the role you're in, being honest with yourself that like this might not work. Yes, I had success with this previously, but this might not be the way forward on this initiative or whatever you're working on, and that's okay. That is okay. I think people sometimes can get, and I've fallen victim to it as well, but sometimes I think we can get into a mindset of, okay, this is like the framework, or like this is the way that it's always been done, and like it needs to work, and it's okay that it doesn't. And it's almost impossible for it to work in every scenario.
And I think one of the things that we always, not we, the three of us, but just like the collective product management discipline forgets is that like product management is like, it's like barely a field in and of itself. It's only really existed for a little while. Even if you think about product management prior to modern Silicon Valley first sort of tech, and even tech in 2010 versus tech now, zero interest rate environment to post 0% interest rate environment, everything is so different. It's almost like unwise to even assume that the ways that we did things a decade ago, which is not a lot of time, are even relevant now. So I find myself having to reflect pretty often on like, what is working? What value do I provide? What value do I get out of the job? Why do we even call it product management? I'm not really managing a product. I'm helping to move forward a product strategy and helping to build. I'm not actually building, but I'm kind of building. There's so many weird, confusing things that go into the term of product management. And I think it like does benefit all of us in the field to do a lot of reflection on what is the value we provide.
I love that. I kind of have like a a pivot a little bit here, but it's also along the same lines. If you are speaking to a job seeker today who is looking for a role in product management, if you've been a product manager and you're going to another company, so they're thinking like they might have these repeatable processes that they can showcase in an interview. But as we just discussed, that isn't really the case. How would you act if you were looking for a new role today and you were trying to showcase the skills that you have, knowing that those processes aren't really necessarily repeatable? Because I've been seeing a lot of like conversations like that on LinkedIn and product managers that are really struggling to get new PM roles because they're having trouble showcasing their value. One role is not like the next.
Honestly, it feels like it's a really hard time to find a new job in product. In fact, like I continually remind myself how grateful I am to even have a product job and the job that I have that I love. Um, when I think about what I've done to sort of like demonstrate my value and sort of like stay relevant, um, it's really been about researching the company and potentially even trying to find people in the company to talk to, which I've done a couple of times. You can leverage your network for that if you want, if you can, and really understanding not just like what is their product strategy, like what are their products, how do they work, like what's the general user sentiment, but other things like how do they work, how do you like to work. I've had to spend a lot of time reflecting on like what are the types of things that I like to do in my day to day, and what are the spaces I like to work in. Like when I was looking for the job I now have, honestly, I looked at and applied to a bunch of roles where I was like, I actually don't think I'm going to enjoy this. And I either withdrew my application, decided to not put a lot of effort into the interview process because I was like, I honestly don't think I'm going to even like this. And I realized that's also kind of a weird privileged position to come from. So I definitely don't want to say, oh, just like don't bother applying to a bunch of jobs that like you might not love, because like we also all need jobs. So I think it's about really trying to think about what do you actually like and get energized by doing? And does it seem, based on what you can ascertain from your own research or potentially like a first round of an interview process, does it seem like that is valued there? And if even like you can't figure out, like you can always ask explicitly, whether it comes up in a first round or even in an application process, about those things. And I think it can be very subtle things like, do PMs have autonomy? Like who calls the shots? Do you care about being the one to call the shots, or do you just want to, own a particular domain and really try and move it forward? Do you just really like collaborating with great engineers or a great designer or whatever? I also think it's fair to like ask the question of whether you want to stay in product, because of the fact that right now it seems like there's not a lot of demand for PMs, and the demand is for extremely high bar PMs. But there's plenty of other fields or like functions in tech where you can sort of exercise the things we do as PMs in other roles. Even like, frankly, some of the best engineers and designers I work with act with a product oriented mindset, because you sort of have to 24 tech. And that's actually part of the reason why there's not a lot of demand for PMs, because a lot of engineers and designers have learned a lot of those fundamentals over the years as well and can do a lot of this on their own. So where do you fit in uniquely, and does that align with what you want to do in your career? And if not, as a PM, is it in like a customer success role, or maybe in a UX or a design role? But I think like this is the type of reflection we all need to be doing as PMs, and I've had to do a fair amount of in sort of like seeking the role that I now have that I'm very happy about. I hope that kind of makes sense.
It does. It also, I mean, I could relate a lot to that as well. I've been working in product roles for over 2 years, but just got my first titled product manager role. It's like humbling to see what that's like, right? To be able to like call yourself a product manager, even though you've been working in product. So you have the experience, but being able to have that title, I think gives you a level of respect in the community that I haven't had before. And so I do feel humbled to have that. And I think there is definitely a level of reflection involved in that feeling of being humbled. And I totally agree with you.
I talk about this a lot and I joke about it, but it really is true. I also look at my own self and what I'm trying to do in my career life also, but specifically my career. I see myself as a product. So that means that I need to revisit like what's making me tick? What am I enjoying? What am I maybe not enjoying? Is product kind of the thing that I'm gonna, last in? I just try to keep an open mind about these things because it really does come down to that being a little more intentional about our self-awareness and where we can see ourselves progressing. I can say right now, I love products. I've been reflecting and throughout my career, and I'm like, yeah, I love product here, but I'm also mindful that we are humans and things change, situations, desires, like skill sets, everything changes. So 10 years down the road, am I still going to be in product? I'm not sure. Yes, maybe, maybe not. And I think just being open with ourselves about that. And like you said, Megan, just kind of having that humbling realization that I'm blessed to be in the role I'm in now, but I know that this might not be forever, and just being candid about it.
Yeah, to be honest with you, I almost want to pull on some of that a little bit. Like, there's no reason why anybody working in any other field in tech should not also be doing the same things. Like, some of the best customer success, customer support people also act like product oriented thinkers, and they're just doing a different function. They're unfortunately not compensated often as highly as PMs are, but like, I've actually had the privilege of coaching quite a few CS folks, operations folks, into product roles over the years, which has been like a really cool experience to see happen. And there's no reason why other disciplines should not be treating their career like a product or exercising these skills. And that's honestly what has me like candidly like reflecting and questioning a lot over the years. What is the unique value that this particular field brings to the table, and why did we conflate a bunch of those disparate things into a single title called product manager? It's just kind of a weird thing to me that I come back to every once in a while. I don't have the answer. Obviously, like, job income and being able to work on something you're passionate about is important. But I think what you said earlier, Santi, as well said, like, we should all be thinking about what does the value provide for whatever the businesses that we're working for. Like, what do they get out of it? What do we provide? What do we get out of it? And that could change depending on any number of factors. And I think the more aware we are of that, the better.
Totally agree. I know we only have a couple minutes left, so I just want to give space if there's anything left that you want to talk about or you want to cover. Because I feel like we kind of hit some of our last questions by just talking. So I want to make sure that if there's anything left that we haven't hit yet, I want to make sure you get a chance to speak on that.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, like, the thing that I thought about a lot, and I talked to you a little bit about this, Santi, before this recording, is like the question of like, why would somebody want to pivot into product today? And I mean that as a genuine question, and not from the perspective of like disparaging the product discipline. Like, I am grateful to have done this job for 12 years and, you know, keep doing it at least for the foreseeable future. But when I started in product 12 years ago, tech was in a very different place. There's plenty of other fields that are, sort of looking for product talent and many of the same skills that aren't tech. I think that it's worth asking the question of like, what about tech? What about product in tech appeals to you? Because the demand for roles, or sort of like the supply of roles, is smaller. The demand for people seeking those roles is still very high, but there's plenty other places where you can add value, whether it's in tech or in some other field as a product manager or not. And I also don't mean that from perspective of like defending my own position as a staff PM in tech, but I do think it's worth asking the question of like, why make that pivot, especially in this environment that we find ourselves in now, where tech companies are trying to be more efficient, not trying to, just hire a bunch of people to throw at a problem, but being a lot more careful with how they spend things for a bunch of, capitalist reasons that we also don't need to get into in this podcast. I think it's worth thinking about those things, maybe from the perspective of not feeling down if you keep applying for jobs and it's not working out, or you're trying to find a way to pivot, from that CS role into a product role and you can't figure out a way to do it. But again, there's plenty of other ways that you can exercise those skills, find career advancement, maybe in tech, maybe not. Any number of possibilities abound. And I don't see enough people talking about that.
Very fair.
I definitely am seeing more and more conversations happening, that product management is dead is like a big conversation that's been going around recently. And I'm seeing more and more of that on like LinkedIn, especially. I mean, and that's where I spend most of my time networking. So maybe that's not just the only space, it's just the most common space. I'm seeing a lot of those conversations. And I know Santi's been seeing it too, because we're going back and forth about it, right? Like her and I are like, you see this one?
Yeah, yeah, I gotta be honest. Like, I see those things every once in a while, and to be honest with you, it's just like it's just annoying and frustrating to me at this point because one, we've already talked about just in this call how many different there's so many different ways of even articulating what product management even is. So to just declare an entire thing dead when we all have different definitions of what it is just feels problematic. One, and two, like I I don't actually feel like it's dead. I think maybe it was overblown for a long time in terms of like the impact, the demand, or sort of like the need for lots of product talent. And again, maybe that was a byproduct of the 0% interest rate era that we were in before, that we're not in now. I think it's almost like a recalibration of like what is the true value and the size of this space, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense to me, especially what we were talking about earlier about even just self-reflecting on what is your value and what do you bring to an organization that's unique. So I think that aligns. I have just like one last question before we end and wrap up today. And this is more of a personal question. So I know we're going to be sharing this podcast with others, and I just want to allow you to share maybe three things that if someone watches this podcast and wants to connect with you directly, what are three things that you would love to talk to someone about that they can network with you about? And maybe that's music. It doesn't have to necessarily be work related.
I was actually gonna say I'm laughing because we could talk about product stuff, but like I get so much more energized by talking about some other things. One of which is just like, well, music. Well, I'll talk to anybody about music and like their music taste, what they like, and stuff like that. Music theory, like that. I'm a huge nerd for that stuff. Another is I actually love just the space of social media, and not just like social media marketing, but also just like the psychology and sort of like the weird effects on our culture it is having. That's one of the reasons why I'm so energized by the work we're doing at Buffer. I love talking about that stuff. I talk about that a lot online, less on LinkedIn and more on like the other platforms like Threads, Blue Sky, stuff like that. Maybe a third thing that I'd love to, talk about is honestly just like workshopping like really tough problems, whether it's like product manager or not. I do just love like spitballing ideas and like kind of working through breaking down really, messy or complicated problems. in any context.
I hit you up for some math problems, is what you're saying.
Brandon loves math, everyone. Note it. It's going in his LinkedIn bio. Oh, that's awesome. I actually have one more question. Sorry, just to end this off on a fun little note. Do you have a food that you love that most people don't? And defend why you love it. You don't have to defend why you love it, but defend the food.
I feel like any food that I like is probably a pretty widely accepted food. Like, so, okay, here's one. I think it's widely accepted that mashed potatoes are great, but I think I like it as in like my tier list of foods. It's like definitely S tier, like top 5 foods of all time. And I think a lot of people like it, but it's maybe not like in their top 3, if that makes sense.
Okay, that's fair.
Do you like them with gravy?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Garlic roasted, like with some of the skin still in. There's so many different like subtle variants of potatoes, and they are like quite simply like I literally had some leftover mashed potatoes with lunch today. There's actually a running inside joke at Buffer about the different ways of making potatoes. It's not worth getting into, but that's very.
And you're included on all of them, I'm assuming.
I'm a fan of many. I do have an opinion.
We're gonna have a follow up to this podcast just on the different ways to make potatoes, everyone. So stay tuned for that.
Well, thank you so much for being a guest on our podcast, Brandon. It's been so great to have you. And I feel like so many people are going to learn from this episode. So thank you so much for joining.
Yeah, thanks for me. 45 minutes.
Thank you so much.